All right, so moving on now to the second part of our lesson, we're going to look at Sir Walter Scott, the Scottish author, and the way in which Wollstonecraft made an opening statement for feminism. Walter Scott does the same thing for the historical novel. Similarly, there were historical novels before Walter Scott, but he set a certain precedent, did the historical novel in a certain way that really set the template for all historical novels to follow. And he was the most popular author of the early 19th century. And so, building on what Maria Edgeworth did that we talked about in the first lesson, he really helped bring the novel into popularity. As I said earlier, before the 19th century, poetry was the dominant form. Drama was also very popular. Novels were not yet very popular. Only a few novels had been written. Things like Robinson Crusoe, some of the work by Henry Fielding. There were not many novels before the 19th century. It was seen as lowbrow. Then you had educated people doing really creative things like Edgeworth, Walter Scott, and Jane Austen come along. They put the novel on the map. And at the time, Walter Scott was the most popular, most commercially successful one. Of course, today Austen is the most popular and successful one, rightfully so, but at the time it was Walter Scott. So he was very influential. He grew up in the Scottish border country. He was born in a populated city, but at a very early age, I think Edinburgh, but a very early age, for his health, his family moved to the Scottish border country, which is an area of Scotland that borders England. And so there had been a lot of skirmishes and battles between the Scottish and the Irish. The Scottish and the Irish have a colonial history, if you will. Excuse me, the English and the Scottish have a colonial history, if you will. I was getting ahead of myself. I was going to say, much like England and Ireland. So it's different. I mean, it's not the exact same relationship, but um, there's a similarity in the type of relationship in that England similarly oppressed Scotland, and there's a colonial kind of a history there, which we'll talk about more in a minute. Um, What's really significant to understanding the history between England and Scotland is the Jacobite movement and Jacobite rebellion. So, if you know your history of English monarchs, give me a minute here because I'm going to go through a little bit of this history. But if you know your history of English monarchs, you're familiar with Henry VIII, his daughter Queen Elizabeth. They were powerful monarchs of England in the 16th century. They're from the Tudor family. Um, one, uh, one of another royal family, the Stuarts, married a Tudor in the late 16th century. And so when Queen Elizabeth passed, a Stuart ascended to the throne of England for the first time. What's significant about this is there were Stuart kings of England for about 150 years, from the beginning of the 17th century, um, excuse me, for about 80 years, from the beginning of the 17th century through 1688. The kings of England were from the Stuart line. And what's significant about that is the Stuarts were Scottish. They were Scottish kings. The Stuarts had been kings of Scotland before their marriage to the Tudors, their alliance with England, and their ascension to the English throne. So it's hugely significant that for roughly 80 years you had essentially, you could say, Scottish kings on the English throne. Due to a variety of factors, the last Stuart king, James II, um, lost power in what they call the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And so James was the last Stuart on the throne, and his name, James, a Latinate version of that is um, Jacobite. And so that's where the term Jacobite comes from. And so basically, there was this Jacobite rebellion from 1688 to 1745, where were these various skirmishes um, between England and these Jacobite soldiers, which were basically Highlanders. If you know that term Highlander, it refers to a Scottish soldier from an earlier time these are the Highlanders. These are who Scott's writing about. And these are the battles they fought for basically some freedom um, from England. And so, where Scott lived growing up after this, in the late 1700s, um, he grew up where this war-torn history of England and Scotland was very fresh in people's minds, and there were stories of it constantly told, but they were oral stories, ballads, um, and folklore. So people would tell these stories out loud. Um, and so Scott really went with that and incorporated this folklore into his literature. And so he really became this author who encapsulated the Scottish perspective of their war torn history with England. And in addition to essentially inventing the historical novel and helping the novel go from lowbrow to the popular form of literature, his other great contribution is encapsulating this Scottish culture, this way of life in the borderlands of Scotland that was essentially lost after the 18th century. Why was it lost? Well, the native traditions of the Highlanders were suppressed by the British government. The Scottish and the British were different. The British government wanted to integrate all subjects. They wanted to make everyone British. And so, as the Jacobites, the Highlanders, lost out, their culture started to disappear as the Scottish became more British, would be that's a really quick summary, but that's essentially what happened. So while growing up, Scott acquired this history of this past way of life, and it had been kept alive by these oral traditions. And he wanted to keep it alive further, so he incorporated it into his novels. And that's why they're historical novels. And so there's this conflict between past and present. This is a past way of life, it's disappearing. But in the present, we're doing what we can through folklore and now the novel to keep it alive. Along these lines, Scott composed a collection of border ballads in the early 19th century to help preserve what he called the authentic features of the Scottish character that were, in his words, daily melting into those of their ally. And by ally, he means Britain. And so he's using ally in not a satirical way, but a way of kind of gesturing in kind of an ironic way, gesturing toward this is we are allies with Britain. We're incorporated into Britain, but we have our own unique culture. We're losing through that process. He's trying to preserve it. So as I said, he didn't invent the historical novel, but we almost might as well say he did because he gave it the significance it would always have. In other words, there's a sense of authenticity to Scott's novels. When reading them, it's important to consider that they tell us as much about the present as they do the past. But there is a drive, a striving for authenticity there that I think is the modern day marker of the historical novel. You have other novels set in the past that are using the past as a vehicle to tell a modern day story. But true historical novels really focus on telling the story of the past, and that's what Scott was doing. So in that sense, he didn't write the very first historical novels ever published, but he invented the style of historical novel. That's the style we know of it today. As I said, he was the most famous writer during his life. So we're going to look at some general themes of Scott's writing. He, like Jane Austen, wrote a number of novels that were very popular, but all too long to read in a class like this that covers so much literature. And so what I'm going to do here is look at some themes, some big themes that prevail throughout Scott's works, and then try to see how those themes appear in the very short piece we're reading for this class. So one of his ideas, and this is quoted from the textbook because I think they say it so well, I think they say it better than I could, is the protagonists of Scott's novels mediate between a heroic but violent old world, so the past, that can no longer survive, that past way of life is disappearing, and an emerging new world that will be both safer than the old one, ensuring the security of property and the rule of law, and duller, allowing fewer opportunities for adventure. So you have an old way of life, the way of the Scottish Highlanders, where it's violent. It's not necessarily safe, but there's a true sense there of what a hero is. This is almost kind of a medieval romance idea. Scott's novels are often referred to as historical romances. And so here we have that cross connection between the capital R romanticism and the lowercase r romance, where you think of the kind of clear cut hero you had in medieval romances. Scott is celebrating that kind of a hero, but he's saying in the modern world, in the 19th century, that kind of hero, can't really exist anymore. And there are some good things about the modern world, but we're also losing something very important. Scott's approach was timely, and this is how he appealed, why he was popular at the time, and that it acquiesced to the inevitability of social progress. So things are changing, we can't help that. He acknowledges that. But it also nostalgically acknowledged the allure of the past. So, in other words, you have Scott writing in the early 1800s, and the Jacobite Rebellion ended in 1745. That's not much more than 50 years. You're talking 50, 60 years. These things he's writing about are disappearing, but they're still very fresh in his readers' minds. Some of his readers may very well have been alive when things were this way, this past way of life, and so people are experiencing sweeping changes. They're experiencing the transition to modernity during their lives and transition into a modern world. Scott, and that's an incredible change to go through in your lifetime. I don't think we've experienced anything like that. You might be able to make the argument about the onset of social media, but I still don't think it's quite to the level of change these people experience in these rural places, in these borderlands during Scott's lifetime. And so to be able to look to the changes happening and engage with those in a way that says they're inevitable, but, and then celebrate that past way of life, he filled a very specific niche at the time that made him immensely popular. In what was going on in the Scottish borderlands, there was a universal aspect to it. Um, Not everyone was experiencing quite the same thing with the Jacobite rebellion and the disappearance of the Highlander culture, but you had the Industrial Revolution. You had predominantly rural country becoming urban. You had farming communities going to manufacturing communities. This is a time of sweeping change. And the feudal kind of medieval bonds that were part of the Highlander culture, um, those were celebrated throughout Britain, not just in these Scottish borderlands. And so the disappearance of a medieval kind of feudal way of life and transition into a modern, market driven, industrial way of life was something not unique to the borderlands. And so Scott really filled a niche by acknowledging the inevitability of change, but also celebrating the past. And that's why he was the best selling author of his day. Let's talk about the specific poem we're going to look at now. I've chosen this poem because it's a narrative poem. Scott started out writing narrative poetry and eventually shifted to the novel. I really wanted to have you read some fiction by Scott, but the one piece of fiction in here, an excerpt from his novel Red Gauntlet, has this intense Scottish dialect, and it's part of the authenticity that Scott brings to his writing, which is so great. So you should maybe look at that excerpt from Red Gauntlet and try to read maybe a page of it and see the dialect. It'll be challenging to read, but it'll feel very authentically Scottish. However, I thought to ask you to read all of that would be a little too challenging. And so instead, I asked you to read this short excerpt from one of his poems. That his poems are narrative poems, as in they're different from the poems we read last time by Blake and Wordsworth and Burns and Newton. These are poems that tell a story. So they're closer to Scott's fiction, even though they're technically poetry. And so the one we're going to look at is called The Lay of the Last Minstrel. So a lay is a song in medieval culture, and a minstrel is someone who go around and sing for people, especially to kings. And so it's the lay of the last minstrel, emphasizing this transition. And this is a long narrative poem that tells a story. It's in verse. We're going to read from it in a minute. I love the rhyming, but it's the way it goes. It goes more like a novel or a story than a poem. And so this is the full text. We have just the introduction here. It tells two stories. But the introduction, I think, sets it up well and encapsulates these themes. We see the rhyming and the narrative, so it's really cool. Scott described the minstrel, the main character here, as a transition figure who lived through the revolution of 1688. So one thing you almost always see in Scott's novels is he's writing about an earlier time than the one in which he lived. And so here he's writing about shortly after the revolution of 1688, where the Stuarts lost the throne. It's after that. This figure is a survivor of it. So much as Scott himself was a transitional figure, so is his protagonist here. And again, the protagonists of many of his novels were these transitional types of figures. So we're seeing that the short story here, short narrative poem, encapsulating a theme that's also present throughout his novels. There's a connection between the author and the character. He's telling a modern or contemporary audience about an earlier time. So Scott wrote books, novels set during the Jacobite Rebellion, set during the Crusades. He was always writing about an earlier time. Here, the minstrel is, I don't know exactly how long, maybe 20, 30 years after the glorious revolution of 88, and he's singing to people about the Stuart legacy. So the author and the character have something in common here. And finally, the minstrel song conveys the power of words. This goes back to what I said about my teaching philosophy in the first lecture, that literature has the ability to influence cultural change. Scott was trying to do that. He had a population of people reading his books who were struggling with the sweeping changes of the Industrial Revolution, being integrated into the British identity, lacking their own identity of autonomy and freedom that they once had, the disappearance of a way of life. And he was trying to reach those people and assuage them, console them through his writing. And so the power of the minstrel song here reflects the power that Scott believed historical fiction could have. And it's really cool. So we're going to look at 5 different sections of the poem to tell the story. It begins with a description of the minstrel. The way was long, the wind was cold, the minstrel was infirm and old. His withered cheek and tresses gray seemed to have known a better day. So as you can tell, it's very rhythmic, and it's rhyming. It has a beat to it, but it tells a story. If you've read things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, those are narrative poems. They tell a story, but you're reading those in translation unless you can speak Greek. So here we have a story, but we get a sense for the rhythm and the rhyming. If you could read the Iliad and the Odyssey in Greek, they would have a similar feel of rhythm and rhyming. But what's the story here? What's the narrative? So he's got an aged protagonist. The guy is old and gray and not strong. But this establishes him as that tiny kind of transition figure we're talking about. What do we see in the opening 4 lines? This guy is a relic of an earlier time. What time is that, you might ask? Old times were changed, old manners gone, a stranger filled the Stuarts' throne. The bigots of the iron time had called his harmless art a crime. A wandering harper, scorned and poor, he begged his bread from door to door. In tune to please a peasant's ear, the harp a king had loved to hear. So the time period, as we know from the context, is the time of the Stuarts, when these Scottish kings were on the throne of England. And speaking here, I think not about a Stuart king after the first couple of lines, but about the minstrel. Um, he once played for these Stuart kings, played his songs for them, but now that they're no longer king, he's been turned out and is wandering and poor, and at best he can play for peasants. Then he comes across this castle and is invited in by the Duchess. The Duchess marked his weary pace, his timid mien and reverend face, and bade her page the menials tell that they should tend the old man well, for she had known adversity, though born in such a high degree, in pride of power, beauty's bloom, had wept o'er Monmouth's bloody tomb. So the Duchess is a widow, and if you look at the footnotes, you'll see she's a widow. Her husband was again connected to that Stuart legacy, but she lost her husband, so she knows tragedy, just as the minstrel knows tragedy. And so this is an important theme. There's a human connection here. They're able to empathize with each other. They both felt pain of loss. And here he tries to play a song for her. He tried to tune his harp in vain. The pitying Duchess praised its chime, and gave him heart and gave him time, till every string's accordingly was blended into harmony. So just as he felt a connection to her in the past verse, or the past stanza, here she feels a connection to him. He tries to play a song and he can't summon the energy to play his song. He fails. But she's patient with him. She encourages him. She praises his chime, gives him time. And so her sympathy, encouragement, and patience enable the minstrel to perform his song. Because as you'll see in the final example here, he does indeed perform his song well. And so you have this human connection, this empathy gives him the ability to have success where he didn't before. With all a poet's ecstasy, in varying cadence, soft or strong, he swept the sounding chords along. The present scene, the future lot, his toils, his wants were all forgot. Cold diffidence and age's frost, and the full tide of song were lost. So here, if we compare and contrast with the first passage we looked at, all of those sad things, his age, his cold, he's wandering out in the cold, he's not doing well. That all fades away when, through the Duchess's encouragement and patience and sympathy, he's able to finally perform the song. And so this shows that power of words and of music that Scott was talking about. And if you look at the lines here, the present scene, the future lot, his toils, his wants were all forgot. So not only is he able to play the song, playing the song makes things better. And with the line, the present scene, the future lot, we have a reference to that transitional time, that changing of a way of life. So the present and the future are troubling because people are going through sweeping changes. They don't know what to expect. By playing a song from the past, we didn't look at a passage where it describes the song, but it's from the time of the Stuarts. So by looking at this past song and celebrating this past culture and way of life, it assuages, it appeases the reader who's struggling with what's happening in the present and in the future with these sweeping changes. So some final things we learn from this. The title is really important. The Lay of the Last Minstrel. The title emphasizes that these sweeping changes are inevitable. As I talked about before, what Scott really does is he acknowledges the inevitability of change while celebrating the past. So with the song, the lay, you have the past. With the word last minstrel, you have the present or future. And so the way he appeases people, helps people in the present is by celebrating the past. You get that even in the title. Time is one of the most important themes here. Like that line, the present scene, the future lot, that references time. The sweeping changes of the passage of time. But the minstrel's song makes it better, which we already talked about. So you also get the power of song here. That's the other phrase I put in bold to identify another important theme. The theme of human connection is really important. The minstrel wouldn't be playing for the Duchess, if he hadn't identified her own tragic circumstances. but through the connection she feels to him, she's able to encourage him, and then he plays the song. So I guess what you could say is key to combating the um, sweeping changes is individuality and finding a connection between humans. Finally, I just like to add that through fiction, Scott did for Scotland what Edgeworth did for Ireland. So the way, so challenged Edgeworth challenged the British condescension, demeaning of Irish people through her play with the Irish bulls. Scott brings some of the unique Scottish individuality to the literary scene at a time when England's trying to assimilate, integrate Scotland. And so they both stood up for their countries that were being brought into this British Union. Scott had more popularity and notoriety during his lifetime, I think, because he struck that chord in bringing the past and the present together. But both were very formative and influential to looking at the novel, bringing the novel, doing the novel in a way that the upper class appreciated so that it became popular. Um, and so Scott was influential in a number of ways.